Good afternoon. I'm Melanie Holcomb. I'm a curator in the Department of Medieval Art and the Cloisters, and my colleague Barbara Boehm and I organized the installation of the Washington Haggadah, Medieval Jewish Art in Context. It's on view in the Fleischmann Gallery for Late Medieval Art here in the main building. And we want to welcome you all here today for what's going to be a marvelous program in conjunction with that installation. Out in the blogosphere, where there's a great deal of wisdom, I think, someone who has been following our endeavors to show Jewish art here in the medieval department recently posed a very astute question. What's a great encyclopedic museum like the Met to do when a group pretty much got left out of the encyclopedia? She's referring to the fact that we don't have a great deal of Jewish art here on view, and in our defense, I will say that Jewish art from the Middle Ages is exceedingly rare, and the history of how and why those rarities end up where they do is often a fascinating and complicated story. I think we're going to be hearing some of those stories today. But in direct response to that very practical question, I can respond that we work in partnership with others. So we are here today to celebrate our recent partnership with the Library of Congress, which has so generously lent to us the Washington Haggadah. It will be here for 3 months in Gallery 307, if you like to use the map, alongside related objects from our collection. I should add that the library is generously allowing us to turn the pages during the time that it is here. So you should come back again and again, for we'll have a new view each month. The Haggadah's presence here is both a continuation of and a departure from some of the work we have been doing here at the Met to represent Jewish artistic heritage from the Middle Ages. We have for several years now partnered with the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary to display medieval manuscripts from their extraordinary collection. We will continue to do that, and the next manuscript from the JTS Library will be installed next week. Here's a little preview of it in the medieval galleries. It's a great. We're very amused and kind of love this case because we often have to clean it. In fact, we have to clean it more than any other case because there's so many nose prints on it from people wanting to get as close as possible to see it. So that's a great thrill on the curatorial side. It's a Bible. This next work is a Bible decorated with micrography, that great feat of calligraphy at which so many Jewish scribes excelled, and which pictures are literally drawn with words. So again, you must come at the end of the week to see that marvelous work. But then, thanks to the support of the Berg Foundation, we are embarking on a parallel initiative to bring monuments of Hebrew manuscript illumination to the Met. These will be from outside of the New York area, and they will be in our galleries at intervals over the next 3 years. The Washington Haggadah is the first in that series. The Washington Haggadah was, of course, a luxury manuscript, and that did not preclude, though, its use at the seder table for centuries. And I should add that it need not preclude its use at the seder table today. Harvard University Press has recently published a beautiful and affordable facsimile of this manuscript. It's in our shop, and the facsimile is accompanied by 2 fascinating essays. So it is a great honor today to have the esteemed authors of those essays here today to speak to us. Before I introduce our speakers, there are a few people I need to thank. Many people work together to bring about installations such as these. Sharmila Sin and Phoebe Gilman at the Harvard University Press, and the staff at the Library of Congress, most especially Tambra Johnson and Yasmin Khan, were instrumental in bringing about this loan. There are too many names to mention of folks here at the Met who have helped us. If you're in the audience, you know who you are, but I do want to call attention to Joseph Lowe and his staff in the education department for helping to organize today's lecture. And then one more note, you can see that we're using captions today, and that will be for our first lecture only. There will be a very short break between the two lectures, not even long enough for you to go out to the bathroom or even to go out and view the manuscript. So sit tight, just stand and stretch your legs, and then we'll move on to the second lecture. Our first speaker today is David Stern. He is the Moritz and Josephine Berg Professor of Classical Hebrew Literature at the University of Pennsylvania, where he served for many years as the director of the Jewish Studies program. Educated at Columbia College and Harvard University, he's also taught at Princeton University, the University of Judaism in Los Angeles, the Hebrew University, and the University of Washington. He's received numerous awards and fellowships, including those from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies. He is also a fellow at the American Academy of Jewish Research. Stern's field of specialization are classical Jewish literature and the history of the Jewish book. He is prolific, having published 8 books and countless essays and reviews for both scholarly and general audience publications. In 2007, he curated the critically acclaimed exhibit Chosen, Philadelphia's Great Hebraica at the Rosenbach Library and Museum in Philadelphia. He is currently working on 2 books about the history of the Jewish book. The first of these, The Jewish Library, 4 Jewish Classics and the Jewish Experience, will be published this year. The second book, Through the Pages of the Past, the Story of the Jewish Book, will be published in 2012. His talk today, coming in part from his essay in the facsimile, is The Washington Haggadah, The Life of a Jewish Book. Professor Stern.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here today to be able to speak to you. As anyone who works with books knows, books are like people. They have lives. Those lives have stories, and those stories extend even into the afterlives of books with the histories of their owners and readers. And if books are like people, Jewish books are like Jews. They have Jewish lives, and the story of those lives are Jewish stories, with tales of wanderings from one country to another, across continents and oceans, and with accounts of near destruction, and alas, more often than one would wish, of destruction too, but also of miraculous salvations, and above all, of survival. In one way or another, Jewish books inevitably reenact in their pages the lives of the Jews and Gentiles who have produced, owned, and studied them. In this talk today, I want to relate the life of one book, the Washington Haggadah, the remarkable manuscript which, as we've just been told, is now on exhibit in this great museum, and a book whose facsimile we are also here to celebrate. The Washington Haggadah takes its name from its final home, the Library of Congress of the United States of America in Washington, D.C., which was the last destination in the lengthy journey that this volume has taken in the course of its life as a book. The title is a recent one. The formal beginning of the Haggadah's life is recorded in the book's colophon, the technical term for a paragraph usually found at the end of a manuscript which records its history of composition. The work was completed, and it is sufficient, and today is the 25th day of the month of Shvat in the year 238, according to the short enumeration in our calendar, January 29th, 1478, the word of the least of the scribes, Joel, the son of Simeon, of blessed memory. Although Joel does not say where the Haggadah was produced, scholars have established the fact that Joel wrote it in Germany. In later centuries, it traveled to Italy, and then passing through a series of owners, the book was brought to America in circumstances that themselves bear remembering. And even in America, the Haggadah has not completely rested. It has traveled across this country in different exhibitions, and now, as you've heard, it's visiting New York. The life of the Washington Haggadah is not yet over. Now, the story of the Washington Haggadah, like that of every Passover Haggadah, began much earlier than the moment of its actual production. Strictly speaking, it began with the formulation of its text, a process that took at least 10 centuries, and that text itself derives from a ceremony, the Passover seder, the ritual banquet held on the first nights of Passover. The seder itself traces its origins back to the earliest beginnings of the Israelite nation with their exodus from Egypt. And the story of that exodus is told, of course, in the biblical book of Exodus. In tracing its history, then, one literally traverses nearly the entirety of Jewish history and the length of its literature. Within the limitations of this talk today, I don't have time to trace in detail the full history of the Haggadah, let alone that of the Seder. But a few facts about both are necessary in order to appreciate the Washington Haggadah story. While the roots of the Seder lie in the biblical injunction to offer the paschal sacrifice and eat it on the night following the 14th day of the month of Nisan, and after that to celebrate Chag HaMatzot, the festival of unleavened bread, for 7 days, and to explain to one's child the meaning of both rituals, the Seder as we know it did not emerge until late antiquity, in the centuries following the Common Era. Our earliest description of a Seder is found in the great rabbinic legal document edited in the early 3rd century, the Mishnah, in the tractate Psachim, chapter 10. And as one can deduce from other rabbinic works like the 2 Talmuds and the post-classical rabbinic texts, the Mishnah's Seder continued to evolve in the subsequent 6 or 7 centuries. Over this period, there came to exist at least 2 distinct versions of the Seder, one deriving from the Mishnah's text, which continued to be followed in Byzantine Palestine and its offshoots, the other a Babylonian revision of the earlier Palestinian Seder, which was practiced nearly everywhere else in the Jewish world. While the 2 versions were largely similar, there were some significant differences between them. For example, while the Babylonian Seder has the famous 4 questions, the Palestinian version had only 3. Eventually, the Palestinian version died out, and the Babylonian one became the near universal standard. Now, for these first 9 or 10 centuries of the Seder's history, there does not appear to have existed a Haggadah, that is to say, a written text for the Seder. The ceremony, with its various recitations, was still short enough that most people could learn it by heart, and they knew the sequence of ritual foods. Our earliest, near-complete copies of the Haggadah are 2 texts, both from Egypt and from the 11th century, that were preserved in the Cairo Geniza, and today are owned by the libraries of the University of Pennsylvania and the Jewish Theological Seminary. This image contains 1 leaf from Penn's copy. It's hard to see, but on the top of the page, you can just make out the beginning of the 3 questions. These early Haggadot actually still preserve the Palestinian version, probably right before its extinction. Indeed, these copies date from a period before the Haggadah had even become its own book. Originally, the Haggadah was copied as part of the Siddur, the prayer book, and someone simply detached these pages from the prayer book, probably to use it at a seder. And as you can see, these early Haggadot, with their large, loopy script, were very modest books. By the 13th century, probably first in Spain, known in Jewish tradition as Sfarad, and later in Germany and northern France, the territory known as Ashkenaz, the Haggadah had become a book in its own right. By the second half of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th, lavish, decorated, and illustrated Haggadot were also being produced in both centers. Now, the actual literary text of the Haggadah was remarkably similar in Ashkenaz and Sfarad, but the overall material shape of the Haggadah and its character as a book was significantly different. These differences can be seen in their structure and contents, as well as in their illustrational programs. In Sfarad, the Haggadah was almost a kind of mini holiday prayer book containing at its beginning and end the special prayers and liturgical poems, the piyutim, that were recited in synagogue on Passover. The illustrations in these Haggadot are mainly found in a series of miniatures typically located at the beginning of the Codex, and that retell the history of Israel, beginning either from the creation of the world or the birth of Moses, and concluding with pictures of contemporary Jews making preparations for the seder. This image is from the series at the beginning of the famous Sarajevo Haggadah and depicts, on the right-hand page, the communal soup kitchen and distribution of matzot, and on the left-hand side, the family returning home from the synagogue after the evening prayers on the first night of Passover. The illustrations in these Haggadot were often done by Christian artists. The miniatures reflect the influence of French salters, and the quality of the illustrations is high and accomplished, even sophisticated. In contrast to the public communal nature of the Sephardic Haggadah, the Haggadah in Ashkenaz was very much a domestic book. It frequently begins with the ritual of searching for leaven, a ritual specifically performed within the privacy of the home, and almost never includes the synagogue prayers or poetry. In contrast to the Sephardic miniature sequences, the illustrations in the Ashkenazic Haggadot tend to be found largely in the margins of the Haggadah and typically relate to the Haggadah's text on the page and to the rituals performed on its page or to the biblical narrative of the exegesis. The page on the screen here is from the Bird's Head Haggadah, called this because all the Jewish figures in the Haggadah are depicted with the heads of birds. And this page records the parts of the seder known as karpas, the hors d'oeuvres course of the seder meal, which consists today of eating greens dipped in salt water or vinegar, and safun, where the head of the household breaks the middle matzah into two pieces and places one piece, what we today call the afikomen, aside. The picture on the bottom of the page depicts both acts, karpas on the left, and on the right, as you can see, a little bird-headed boy placing the afikomen beneath the tablecloths. In fact, this depiction may be some of our earliest evidence for the child's game that this part of the ritual has either evolved or devolved, depending on your perspective, into. Indeed, one of the purposes of placing this picture on this page may have been precisely to tell the children to hide the afikomen at this point in the Seder. As you can see from this image, the illustrations in this Haggadah and others like it are folksy, almost cartoonish, much less sophisticated and stylized than those in the Sephardic Haggadot. Despite their geographical distance from each other, the two Jewish centers in Ashkenaz and Sfarad were very much in contact, and especially from the 14th century on, images and motifs from Sephardic Haggadot, like the pictures for the four sons, made their way into Ashkenazic Haggadot. Book production in both Ashkenaz and Sfarad, however, generally declined from the beginning of the 14th century, as Jewish life in both areas was severely curtailed by persecutions and forced expulsions. Over this century and the next, many Jews fled both centers, some to North Africa and Ottoman Turkey, others to Eastern Europe, and many to Italy, which became a haven especially for Ashkenazic refugees. And among these refugees were a good number of scribes. Now, Italy was the home of the longest continuously inhabited Jewish community in Europe, going back to Imperial Rome, if not earlier, and had long played a formative role in Jewish book culture. The site of the earliest dated Hebrew manuscript written in Europe, Italy was also, beginning in the 15th century, the major site of Jewish book production. Nearly 1/3 of all dated medieval Hebrew manuscripts were written in Italy between 1350 and 1550. Now, in general, the Haggadot produced in Italy follow the Ashkenazic model in terms of their overall structure as essentially domestic books. Germany and North Italy were closely associated during this period, and scribes and illustrators like Joel ben Simeon regularly moved over the Alps and between the two countries. The illustrated Haggadot produced in the two areas, however, defy easy categorization. Some, like the second Nuremberg Haggadah pictured here, have margins packed with drawings of both biblical and ritual scenes, and the illustrations are somewhat reminiscent of the popular folkish style characteristic of the Berg Haggadah. On the other hand, there are the Haggadot produced by Joel ben Simeon and his associates like Meir ben Israel Jaffe of Ulm, the scribe of the first Cincinnati Haggadah, which tend to resemble the 14th century Sephardic Haggadot in their elegance and luxuriousness, and which clearly display the absorption of Italianate features in their use of color and delicate penwork. For all their differences, however, these 15th and early 16th century German and Italian Haggadot share a vision that contrasts sharply to that found in the Spanish Haggadot of the previous century. The Passover Haggadah is a Jewish book of redemption par excellence. This is its major theme, and it looks forward to the redemption in the future by recalling and commemorating the redemption in the past. The most distinctive feature of the Haggadah as a text and as a book is that one can trace its development almost step by step as its Jewish authors and producers move deeper and deeper into their various diasporas and places of geographical and historical exile, from Roman Palestine to Parthian Babylonia, from Babylonia to the European centers of Ashkenaz and Sfarad, and from those centers to all the later homes of Jews in North Africa, Arabia, Eastern Europe, and finally to the Americas and the State of Israel. As one follows these journeys, one sees how closely linked in the Jewish experience are exile and redemption. The imagining of one is inevitably shaped by the experience of the other. It is this linkage between imagining the redemption and experiencing exile that most profoundly informs the Haggadah's history. The German and Italian Haggadot of the 15th and 16th centuries capture one specific moment in that history, which is also the story of the Jewish imagination. That moment and its conception of redemption, the common vision these Haggadot share, is captured in one specific page found in many of these Haggadot. Following the Crusader massacres of the 11th and 12th century, Ashkenazic Jews inserted a special passage known as Shvo Chamatcha that invokes God's wrath upon the Gentile nations. In its earliest version in Ashkenaz, the passage consisted solely of Psalm 79:6. Pour out your fury on the nations that do not know you, upon the kingdoms that do not invoke your name. But the passage was quickly adopted in many cases, adapted in virtually every rite, including those of Sfarad, in many cases with the addition of more verses cursing the Gentiles. Beginning in the second quarter of the 15th century, on the page containing the Shvo Chamatcha, first German and later Italian Haggadot regularly began to include a picture of the Messiah riding on a donkey, often accompanied by Elijah blowing a shofar, and arriving at the home of a Jew. The meaning of the picture's placement on this page is slightly ambiguous. Was it meant to suggest that vengeance against the Gentiles would come as part of the Messianic scenario? Or that the Jews could only imagine such vengeance taking place after the Messiah had arrived? For us, what is most noteworthy about the illustration is that the Messiah is frequently pictured, as I said, as arriving at the private home of an individual Jewish family. This moment in the seder, in which the Shvo Chamatcha is recited, also happened to coincide with the ritual act of opening the front door to the home, an act that may have long preceded the insertion of the Shvoch HaMatcha into the Haggadah, but that was interpreted by Ashkenazic Jews as an invitation to the prophet Elijah, who might actually turn up just then to herald the impending arrival of the Messiah. In fact, one early 16th century writer, the apostate Jew, Antonius Margarita, records a custom among Ashkenazic Jews to have someone dressed up as Elijah fall through the open door into the room at precisely this moment. Now, no two depictions of the scene are identical. Individual artists each developed the image in their own way, and in her essay on the Washington Haggadah's illustrations, Katrine Kogman-Appel describes in detail the singular features of Joel's version in the Washington Haggadah. In all cases, however, the arrival of the Messiah is imagined in dramatically familiar and intimate terms, virtually as a kind of personal salvation, not unlike the notions of personal salvation that were also beginning to penetrate pre-Reformation Christianity at roughly the same time. This, then, is a perfect example of how the specific context of the diasporic culture in which the Haggadah was produced profoundly shaped its idea of redemption. From what we know, illustrated Haggadot like the Washington Haggadah were typically commissioned or bought by the increasingly wealthy members of the growing population of Jewish bankers, merchants, and doctors in Italy and southern Germany. This was a quickly developing market, and it helped support and produce scribes and illustrators like Joel ben Simeon. On all counts, Joel was both a representative figure of his age and also an exceptional figure in several respects. In the first place, he was both a scribe and an artist, two positions that were often held by different persons. He copied and illustrated his own manuscripts, he illustrated other scribes' manuscripts, and he collaborated with other scribes and illustrators to jointly produce lavish manuscripts. All in all, there are 10 manuscripts that Joel himself signed, and between 4 and 9 others that scholars have either attributed or associated with him. This high number of manuscripts is decidedly unusual, if not entirely unparalleled. Joel was born in Cologne in the early 1420s. His full name was Joel Feibusch ben Simeon, and in some manuscripts written outside Germany, he recalled his birthplace by calling himself Ha-Ashkenazi, the Ashkenazi, or the German. In 1424, when Joel was a very young child, the Jews were expelled from Cologne, and his family moved to nearby Bonn, where Joel was raised and lived until 1445 or 1450. He also appears to have received his early training as a scribe and artist in Bonn, and it's possible that he began to travel as an itinerant scribe illustrator even before he left Bonn for good. After finally leaving Bonn, in any case, sometime before 1452, 1453, Joel went south across the Alps to northern Italy. Over the next 30 to 40 years, the surviving manuscripts that he wrote, those which are either signed or attributed to him, include at least 7 more Haggadot, 3 prayer books, and 1 commentary to the Book of Psalms. These manuscripts certainly represent only a fraction of his output. We have no idea how many manuscripts he actually produced. Although we know no more details about his life, it's clear that during this 40-year period, he returned to Germany at least twice to write or illustrate books. During the second trip in 1478, he wrote the Washington Haggadah. Joel then returned to Italy, and scholars believe that as late as 1492, when he would have been 70 or close to it, he was still working intensely, writing a beautifully decorated prayer book known as a Moskowitz Siddur, and participating with a team of artists who jointly illustrated the spectacular Rothschild Machzor. Joel's movements back and forth between Germany and Italy had a major impact on his artistic style. He always remained essentially an Ashkenazic scribe, and to a large extent a German illustrator, but he absorbed the Italian feeling for depth and detail. As Professor Kogman-Appel notes, he was an active agent of cultural exchange, both in his art, but also in liturgical and ritual matters. His Haggadot, and as we shall see, the Washington Haggadah in particular, epitomize the transitional nature of the period in which he lived, a period in which different cultures came increasingly into contact, just as the age of manuscripts was also turning into the age of print. Joel was both a master scribe and a master illustrator. In her talk after mine, Professor Cogman-Appel will speak about Joel's drawings and paintings. I'll concentrate my remarks upon his mastery of the arts of scribal technique, and specifically the kinds of decoration associated with scribal virtuosity. This page is the very first page of the Haggadah and contains the instructions for the search for leaven on the night preceding Passover, the blessings recited over the search, and on the bottom of the page, the order of the seder, kadesh urachatz, and so on. To differentiate these different sections on the page for the reader, Joel, like other scribes, wrote the various sections in distinct hands and sizes, in all 4 different sizes and scripts. Thus, the core text of the Haggadah he wrote in a medium-sized square script, and for other sections he used 3 other sizes, a very large size for illuminated words at the beginning of major sections, a somewhat smaller but still large size for initial words of important passages, and a smaller size which he used for instructions and for some blessings. In addition, he also used a semi-cursive calligraphic script in different sizes. On this page, you can see the large size which he used for initial words and passages. Now, as I just said, one purpose of these different types and sizes of script was to create for the reader a visually transparent hierarchy of texts, but the variation also served a clearly aesthetic purpose in making the less uniform page more interesting to look at. Most of the text is written in a black, dark brown ink, but as you can see, Joel also regularly used red and blue inks, as well as green and lighter brown ones, also to vary the text color. Especially noteworthy are the large painted initial panels, which usually have a blue background with white filigree sprigs and round white flowers with red centers, while the initial words themselves and the frames are in burnished gold leaf. The one you see here, the beginning of the halachma section, is one of the most beautiful in the Haggadah, with its very large square letters in gold leaf against a blue background of red and white flowers, a small gem that literally turns a word into an ornament. In all these examples, you see how Joel's scribal virtuosity extended beyond the mere writing of the text to the overall aesthetics of the text page. One of the general concerns, indeed a virtual obsession of medieval Jewish scribes, was line justification, which in the case of Hebrew texts, which are written right to left, means justified left margins. In order to maintain the justification, scribes utilized different techniques, and Joel employed nearly all of them. Now, on this single page, you can see several of these techniques. On line 1, in green, the word kema is abbreviated and truncated. On line 6 from the top, in yellow at the end of the line, pour lachatzenu is squeezed and compressed. The technical term for this is dilated. And on line 9, in orange, the final mem in the last word on the line is elongated. The most individualistic technique that Jewish scribes used for justification, however, was the employment of graphic forms which look like Hebrew letters, but are actually nonsense letters. Many scribes had their own individual graphic fillers, and on this single page, with its beautiful initial word panel, Joel used the filler 4 times on lines 1, 2, 4, and 7. While the shape of this graphic filler conforms to a basic type used by other Ashkenazic scribes, Joel made it his own by adding to it the descending stroke which curls to the left at its bottom, and at other times analogous ascending strokes. In this way, the graphic filler became, in effect, Joel's scribal trademark, as the Israeli codicologist Malachi Bet Aryeh has called it. Indeed, this unique filler is so characteristic and and unique to Joel's work that scholars have been able to use it to attribute and identify unsigned manuscripts as having been written by Joel. Of all Joel's distinguishing features as a scribe artist, however, the most distinctive are his delicate filigreed panels drawn in various colored inks, which surround the initial words of some key passages. In the Washington Haggadah, some of these frames consist of intricate floral patterns, swirling sprigs and dense curly leaves, as the art historian Bezalel Narkis described them, which show a clear Italianate influence. But other touches are more humorous and witty. On the right side of a number of panels, Joel drew a grotesque face in profile, grimacing toward the outer margin, with a curlicue-like tongue and a long twisting strand of a beard. The first one of these grotesques to appear in the Haggadah is on this page, attached to the initial word in red, Baruch, that begins the Kiddush, the blessing over wine with which the seder begins. On the facing page in the book, at the top right, the initial word Vayechulu, and we're completed, is framed by a king emerging out of a worm-like long neck. And on this page is also found my own personal favorite. Directly beneath the drawing of Jacob, directly beneath the drawing of Jacob, our traveling forefather, at the beginning of the next paragraph, the grotesque profile once again leans out from the side of the Hebrew word vayered, while on top of the word, as you can see, a lively hare flees in the opposite direction, maybe because he knows that Jacob is about to descend to Egypt, and he wants to get out of there as quickly as he can. Elsewhere, in fact, hares in Jewish books often symbolize the people of Israel, and that may be the case here too. And finally, near the Haggadah's conclusion, at the beginning of the Great Hallel, the grotesque profile appears for the last time in an especially ornate and beautiful panel. To my eye, at least, the grotesque here also looks a little tired. I think he's ready to tuck it in and go to sleep, like some of the participants at the Seder as well. For the children at the Seder, in any case, and perhaps for some of the adults, these grotesques were a kind of 15th century version of Where's Waldo. They play a game of hide and seek with the reader. At first, you do not notice them, but when you do, they take you by surprise, making you look ever harder at a text you thought was utterly familiar. Now, taken separately, all these individual scribal practices may seem to be mere details of technique, but collectively, they point to the ways in which a professional scribe like Joel defined his individuality, his character, within a profession that was otherwise powerfully governed by convention. Indeed, such means of individuation turned a figure like Joel from being a mere copyist into a scribe. Even so, scribes always remained copyists in a strict sense. That is to say, their main job was to transcribe their texts from other manuscripts as accurately as possible. Accuracy and faithfulness to the original were the main standards by which copyists were judged. Nonetheless, scribes constantly faced choices as to what to copy, and this task was complicated by the fact that most manuscripts included marginal glosses, corrections, and other additions. Sometimes a scribe copied from multiple manuscripts, and these too may have differed in details, or even in matters of practice when they derived from communities with different customs. In these cases, it was a scribe, not a rabbi or another authority, who decided what to write and copy. And in this way, scribes like Joel served as authorities and as agents of cultural exchange between different communities. In both roles, they could exert great influence and impact. And at other times, by copying certain passages or practices, which they could also preserve long-held customs that were on the brink of falling out of usage. Let me give examples of both phenomena. Because our Haggadah was written while Joel was in Germany, it is not surprising that by and large it follows the contemporary Ashkenazic rite, including a few early features that have since ceased to be practiced. Thus, Before eating the karpas, that hors d'oeuvre section I mentioned earlier, the greens that represent the appetizer course, it is customary to wash one's hands in remembrance of the laws of cultic purity that obtained during the temple period. Because this ritual washing is largely symbolic, however, there was a long-time dispute as to whether or not it is necessary to recite a blessing before doing the ritual washing. Eventually, by the 16th century at the latest, it was conclusively decided that a blessing was not required, and that is the custom followed today by observant Jews. In medieval Ashkenaz, however, opinions were still divided, and in the Washington Haggadah, and the instruction outlined in yellow in the middle of the page, Joel states that the blessing is required. In the same instructions, here in the section outlined by a green line, Joel also writes that one dips the karpas in charoset, the dipping sauce made from fruits and nuts. And indeed, this was the original custom in Ashkenaz. At a later period, salt water or vinegar was substituted for the charoset in order to differentiate the karpas from the bitter herbs, the moror, which are eaten later in the seder and which are still dipped in charoset today, while the karpas is dipped in salt water. But Joel still dipped his karpas in charoset. Now, in both these cases, Joel preserved ancient Ashkenazic practice. In another place, he records a striking innovation that he very likely brought back to Germany from Italy. Since the Talmudic period, the moror, the bitter herb, was typically eaten in the form of a bitter lettuce called latuga, from the Old French laituga, which in turn derives from the Latin lactuta. And even today, many Jews use romaine or other bitter types of lettuce for moror at the seder. On this page, however, in the lengthy section in the middle of the page, in semi-cursive script, Joel writes that when one eats the ancient sage Hillel's so-called matzah sandwich with moror as its filling, one uses horseradish, which he calls by the German name of Moritz. This instruction is among our earliest pieces of evidence for one of the most monumental shifts in the entire history of the Jewish people, the transition from lettuce to horseradish as the preferred form of bitter herb moror. In this otherwise unassuming passage, Joel, in other words, is describing a historical moment of decisive, dramatic change in Jewish history. And at still other times, Joel refused to choose between German and Italian practice and preserved both. At the beginning of the Haggadah, on its first folio, inside a delicately pen-drawn, unraveled scroll at the very top of the page, Joel wrote two formulaic scribal formulae, B'tuv gada atchil lichtov seder shel Pesach, with good luck I shall write the order of the Passover seder, and Kvodcha Hashem, for your honor, God. The first formula is known to have been used by scribes in Ashkenaz and Provence, and occasionally by Ashkenazic scribes in Italy, but the second formula was exclusively used by Italian scribes, and as was suggested by Moritz Steinsnyder, may have been borrowed from Latin scribal eulogies like Deo laus et honor. The presence of both formulae in the Washington Haggadah epitomizes Joel's own position between the two different scribal cultures. Now, of course, Joel was also human and made mistakes while copying. This happens even to the most skillful scribes. On this page, Joel forgot the word Yahalalu, they will praise, in the middle of the line, noticed his mistake, and wrote it in the margin himself. On this page, he skipped Psalms 118:8 and apparently never noticed it, and then a later Ashkenazic owner did and added it to the margins in a rather ugly hand. And on still other pages, later users of the Haggadah wrote still other corrections and additions in the margins. This is the Shmo Chamatcha page, again, which we talked about earlier, containing curses against the Gentile enemies of Israel. The original Ashkenazic practice was to recite a single verse, Psalm 79:6, which is all that Joel himself wrote in the Haggadah. But as you can see on the top of the page, a later user of the Haggadah added another 9 verses, and still another person a 10th verse. These additional verses accord with the northern French rite, but they're written in an 18th century Italian hand, presumably by a later owner of the Haggadah. Now, as this last remark suggests, the corrections and marginal additions to the Haggadah by later hands are important not only for what they can tell us about Joel's scribal competence or about local customs and rites, but also for reconstructing the history of the Haggadah and its own life after it came into existence. The Washington Haggadah's early history remains shrouded in some mystery. Like most professional Jewish scribes in the late Middle Ages, Joel typically wrote on commission for specific clients. The colophon of this Haggadah, however, does not mention a patron or commissioner for the book, which one usually finds in colophons, and this uncharacteristic omission has led some scholars to suggest that Joel may have initially written the Haggadah to be held as stock and then sold later whenever a buyer would turn up. This untraditional practice had in fact become more common in the last decades of the manuscript age and anticipates the modes of production after print. The same rationale would also explain the empty final pages of the last gathering, which Joel may have deliberately left empty in the event that a customer wished to have an additional text written there. And in fact, this turned out to be the case. The customer who finally bought the Haggadah requested that Joel add two special texts, the Eruvei Chatzerot and Eruvei Tavshilin, both of which are special prayers for ritual ceremonies performed in the event that the 2 days of Passover fall on Thursday and Friday. The rituals allow a person to prepare for the Sabbath on Friday afternoon, even though it's a holiday. Now, these two ceremonies need to be performed before Passover begins, and they should therefore be written at the beginning of the Haggadah, not at its end. And in most Ashkenazic Haggadot, this is, in fact, where the prayers are transcribed. The fact that they're found in the Haggadah's final folios adds to the likelihood that they were added after Joel had written the Haggadah and at a specific customer's request. In fact, 1478 was a year when Passover began on Wednesday night and continued through Thursday and Friday, thus necessitating the performance of the two ceremonies that year. If Joel completed his Haggadah on January 29, 1478, he probably began it in late 1477 and was not yet aware of the exact weekdays on which Passover would fall in the coming year. By the time he completed and sold the Haggadah, however, his customer did know that he would need the texts, and therefore requested Joel to write them at the book's conclusion. We do not know who this first customer was who bought or owned the Haggadah, but from Hebrew words that are faintly written on this page in an Ashkenazic hand, probably written as practice phrases, and which appear to have been written not long after Joel wrote the manuscript, it seems quite certain that the first owner was a German Jew. And from the ugly marginal edition of Psalms 118:8 that we saw earlier, which is written in the 17th century Ashkenazic hand, it seems likely that the Haggadah was still in Germany a good 100 years later. Furthermore, the absence of any signatures of Christian censors from the 16th or 17th century, which would almost certainly be found in the book if it had been in Italy during this period, strongly suggests that the Haggadah remained in Germany until the 18th century. By the 19th century, however, we know for certain that the Haggadah was owned by the Provenzali family in Mantua, a very distinguished family with a lineage that went back to Moses ben David Provençal, one of the most distinguished Talmudists of the Renaissance period, and his brother David ben Abraham Provençal, who attempted to establish a Jewish university in Mantua. On this blank page, at the end of the Haggadah, are found again faint lines that name 4 of the members of the Provenzali family in the late 19th century: Amelia, Sapphira, Umberto, and Attilio. And on this page, again at the back of the Haggadah, there is a remarkable note written by one Ettore Finzi in German, dated April 7th, 1879, which was the eve of Passover that year, where he writes that they are sitting at the seder table where they have just sung the first part of the Gada, that's what he calls the Haggadah, the Gada, and are awaiting the food. And after it arrives, they start eating, and a Tory signs off, a guten Appetit. Stains, like the large oval on the bottom of this page, probably stem from wine drops and confirm the fact that the Haggadah was actually used at seders. It was not, in other words, a trophy book that its owners kept locked up in a case for display. For all its beauty and monetary value, it was actually used for the purpose for which Joel ben Simeon had originally written it, as a Haggadah for a seder. All this changed in the early 20th century. While we do not know the exact facts for certain, on June 10, 1902, a book dealer who happened to be in Mantua at the time wrote to Judge Meyer Sulzberger of Philadelphia. Sulzberger was one of the great Jewish communal leaders and collectors of Jewish books of the period, that he was sending him 8 rare books and manuscripts he had bought in Italy, including an illustrated Haggadah written in 1478. This was undoubtedly the Washington Haggadah. For the latter, the book dealer wrote, the asking price was $500. But in a later letter, the dealer conceded that his original asking price may have been too high, and he hinted that he was willing to bargain. Apparently, though, Sulzberger was still not interested, and the Haggadah remained in the dealer's stock for another 14 years. The book dealer was a Russian-born Jew named Ephraim Dinard, who was one of the most exceptional figures in the history of the Jewish book in the last 2 centuries. A bookseller and bibliographer, a publisher and the author or editor of some 50 books of his own, a Zionist activist and publicist, a major crank, and a vitriolic polemicist who railed against a myriad of persons and causes not to his personal liking, Hasidism and Hasidim, Kabbalah, Reform Judaism, he didn't differentiate, communism, the great rabbinic scholar, later chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Solomon Schechter. As you can see, he had a lot of personal dislikes. Dinard was a seminal and still insufficiently recognized figure in laying the foundations for Jewish scholarship in America. Born in the Baltic region of the Tsarist Empire in 1846, Dinard grew up in Lithuania, moved to White Russia, and then went to Crimea, where he became the amanuensis and factotum of the infamous Abraham Furkovich, the Karaite book dealer and collector who was probably the greatest dealer of Hebraica of all time, in addition to being a major forger, thief, finagler, and all-around scoundrel. As you can tell from this picture, he was also a spiffy dresser who liked to play the role of Karaite elder to the hilt. Furkovich also appears to have been a very good teacher and to have taught Dinard quite a bit about the trade as he practiced it. Here's Dinard again. Over time, Dinard grew into an extremely shrewd book dealer who was also deeply mistrusted even by some of his most loyal customers. His indefatigability in obtaining manuscripts and rare printings became legendary early on, as did the questionability of his methods in acquiring them. As Alexander Marx, probably the greatest expert on Jewish books during his lifetime, wrote about Dinard, how he managed to attain some of these unique volumes I do not know, but undoubtedly a considerable number would have perished in the disorders of the last decades if Dinard had not found them a safe resting place in great Jewish and general libraries. In October 1888, with his wife, 4 young daughters, a niece, and 11 pieces of luggage, all of them apparently stuffed with manuscripts and books, Dinard arrived in the United States, where he lived for the next 40 years, with the exception of a brief aborted attempt to settle in Palestine. During these years, Dinard lived in Newark, St. Louis, and for the last 12 years of his life, New Orleans. And in all these places, he published newspapers, including one of the first Hebrew newspapers in America, journals, and many books. Following a time-honored tradition in Hebrew publishing of using fictional places of imprint and invented dates, Dinard issued books from places he called Baltunauka, Chattertown in Yiddish, and the biblical city of Sodom. Both books were actually printed in Newark, New Jersey. And he dated the latter book as having been printed in the printing press of Raziel the Angel 50 years before the creation of the world. That's a very old book. Dinard's lasting contribution, however, was as an agent in laying the foundations of America's greatest public and institutional collections of Hebraica and Judaica. Early on, possibly even before he emigrated to America, Dinard recognized that America was likely to become a center for modern critical Jewish scholarship, and that there would be a need for great Jewish research libraries in the New World to support that research. His main goal, he wrote, and here I'm quoting, was to establish libraries in all the leading cities of our land. It is my hope that in the course of time I shall succeed in decimating Jewish literature in this barren country. If a Jewish scholar needs an ancient text now, he must go to Europe, to the British Museum, or the Bodleian in Oxford. So to remedy that situation, Dinard began by persuading professors like Richard Gottheil of Columbia University to establish Hebraica collections in their university libraries, and private collectors like Judge Sulzberger to build collections which they would eventually donate to public institutions. He also sold an important collection of Judaica objects to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., whose librarian at the time was Cyrus Adler, later to become the president of Dropsy College in Philadelphia, the first non-sectarian institution of higher learning in ancient Near Eastern and Jewish studies in America, and today the Herbert Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. His final sale was that of his own private collection, 12,000 printed volumes, including 16 incunables and 29 manuscripts, to Harvard University, just months before his death in 1930, thereby establishing the foundation for Widener Library's magnificent collection. Dinard's greatest dream, however, was to establish a major Judaica collection in America's national library, the Library of Congress, that would rival the great national libraries of Europe, like the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the British Library in London, and the National Library in Berlin. Now, it was a happy coincidence that precisely at this time, the Library of Congress itself was in the process of becoming a major research library that sought to cover all of world literature and culture. The Library of Congress had been founded originally as a library for Congress in order to serve the particular needs of its members. In 1899, however, Herbert Putnam, a man who could not have been more different from Dinard, was appointed librarian. Putnam's father was the founder of the Putnam Publishing House. Putnam himself was educated at Harvard and Columbia Law, and previously had served as head of the public libraries in Minneapolis and Boston. A true American blue blood, Putnam was also a man of broad cultural and creative vision who envisioned the library as a model of scholarly research in America and as encompassing all of the world's cultures. To this end, in 1904, Putnam acquired a huge collection of classical Indian literature, and shortly later, equally impressive collections of Russian, Chinese, and Japanese literature. Now, Dinard witnessed all this, and he presently sensed that the time was now ripe to realize his own vision of establishing a major Hebraica collection in the Library of Congress. This was actually something he had unsuccessfully attempted some 15 years earlier. In 1909, though, he turned to Putnam again with an offer to sell him a collection, and here I'm quoting, of the oldest and rarest books which are to be found only in the British Museum, and some of them are not to be found even there. Putnam's response was slow in coming, but in 1912, with Silas Adler's assistance, he approached Jacob Schiff, the German-born New York financier and Jewish philanthropist, Jacob Schiff, to ask if he would be willing to purchase Dinard's collection as, quote, a gift to the nation. This gift would serve as, and again I'm quoting, a recognition of the part which Hebrew history, literature, and tradition, as well as the Hebrew race, play and will play in the affairs of this country. Schiff finally agreed, and the Library of Congress purchased Dinard's collection, which consisted of 10,000 books and pamphlets. This purchase came to be known as the first Dinard collection. In 1914, Schiff again bankrolled the purchase of a second collection of 4,200 volumes from Dinard, which he presented to the Library of Congress as the second Dinard collection. In 1916, the library purchased with its own funds a third collection of 2,300 items, and in 1919, a fourth collection of some 3,000 volumes. Altogether, Dinard sold the Library of Congress some 19,300 volumes and laid a strong foundation for its future growth into one of the world's great Hebraica and Judaica collections. The Washington Haggadah most likely arrived at the Library of Congress as part of the third Dinard collection in 1919. And there it remains today, one of the library's treasures and a highlight of its by now truly extensive, even exhaustive, Judaic and Hebraic collection. Dinard's dream has indeed been realized. The Washington Haggadah, however, is no longer a functioning Haggadah, no longer a ritual text used at a seder. It is a Hebrew illustrated manuscript of invaluable worth, available to scholars for research, a window into the world in which it was created and its Jewish culture. But now, through this reissued facsimile edition, the Washington Haggadah is again an accessible book that can be read, studied, looked at, and even brought to the Seder table. It's not even too expensive that one can't afford to spill some drops of wine on its pages. And finally, the Washington Haggadah is genuine proof that the Jews and the Jewish book have truly arrived in America. Thank you very much.